January 12, 1945. The Soviets launch a major offensive in the Vistula that completely overwhelms the German defenses and leads them to be located just a few kilometers from Berlin by the end of that same month. In the midst of this military disaster, in which the German army found itself unable to contain the new Soviet attack, Himmler was appointed commander-in-chief of the Vistula Army Group on January 24th. His orders were to stop the withdrawal of all German units and thereby stop the Soviet offensive and move on to the counterattack as quickly as he could. We already analyzed in another program that I leave you in the description what Himmler's military performance was like during this critical situation. Well, today, we are going to see one of the conversations that Himmler had with one of the best generals of the German army, this being the famous Erhard Rauss. Without a doubt, this dialogue that we are going to see below will help us understand the generalized thinking that many of the German generals had, who, like Rauss, had been fighting since the beginning of the war. In addition, it will help us understand firsthand what the state of the German army was like in 1945 and what were the reasons for its final defeat. This meeting between both men took place during the night of February 13th, this date being a few days before the Germans launched one of their last offensives on the Eastern Front, known as Operation Solstice. Once they had dinner and talked about everyday matters in the presence of different companions, Himmler and Rauss went to a room to talk privately. The first topic to be discussed was the offensive that was being prepared from Pomerania towards the south, in an attempt to defeat all the Soviet vanguards that had been established along the Oder. But once again, the German offensive was very ambitious in relation to the inequality of forces between them and the Soviets. Himmler asked Rauss what his assessment of this operation was, also asking him to be completely sincere. The German general told him that this offensive was madness, and that from the second day onwards, the advance would be paralyzed without having achieved any results. His advice was that those troops had to be used in defensive actions rather than being sacrificed in a futile attack. Himmler then told him that he was of the same opinion as him, but that Hitler had ordered the attack, and the order had to be followed to its ultimate consequences. After evaluating other attacks that the German army was also going to carry out in the vicinity of Lake Balaton in Hungary, in which Rauss's advice was the same as in the previous case, the German general decided to tell Himmler everything he thought. "Herr Reichsführer," Rauss said, "allow me to express my honest opinion about everything that has happened during these years that we have been at war to the man who has the most influence on our leader." The statements I'm going to say next may land me in jail or hanging, but I still have to do it. After these first words, Himmler gave him permission to continue speaking. "Since Stalingrado, our direction of operations has laid serious doubts in the minds of all of us. And over the past few months, our uncertainty has only increased. From the first moment it was seen that it was impossible to fight on a front whose length exceeded 3,000 kilometers, and that our armies did not have the capacity for that task. But even so, we have done it for the last 2 years. Our forces have only strained until they finally broke. During this war of attrition, our armies have been completely depleted, and we have lost numerous allies who have also been crushed by the Soviets. If we have managed to continue fighting for so long, it has been thanks to the courage and tenacity of our frontline officers and soldiers. The High Command has not drawn the conclusion that this war has long been unwinnable and has continued to send large German formations into battles that could not be won. This waste and senseless loss of lives has brought us to the edge of the abyss in which we find ourselves today. Furthermore, all those generals who are trying to avoid this disastrous situation find themselves tied hand and foot and have no freedom to lead their troops independently. Instead, they can only limit themselves to carrying out impossible orders given to them by the Army High Command. As if that were not enough, after failing to carry out one of these orders, they are dishonorably discharged as if they were incapable officers. After these first words, Rauss stopped to see what Himmler's reaction was and whether he proceeded to order his arrest or not. However, Himmler looked at him and told him to continue with his presentation. After this, Rausch continued talking about how to act in different military operations. Instead of organizing an aggressive strategic defense in previously selected and prepared suitable sectors, the only strategy we are ordered to do is not to give up a single meter of land despite lacking strategic value. Regarding the concentrations of troops that we manage to make as reserves, these are always launched in local attacks of no importance, so they are wasted again and again. Rausch then alluded to the disastrous offensive at Kursk, in which the best of the German army was thrown against a wall, later having to face numerous Soviet counterattacks everywhere. Rausch also complained that they were not allowed to build defenses in the rear, to which they could retreat to stop the Soviets more effectively, and that because of this, when the Red Army broke the German first line, the German front was completely crumbling. The next point on which Rausch focused was on the so-called fortress cities. Rausch commented that desperate and hopeless combats are carried out in them, in which both the position and the garrison are lost, without any type of strategic value. This made the army's distrust of the High Command increasingly greater. There have already been many sectors of the front that have been completely surrounded and that have had to slowly succumb until their total destruction. Whether in the Caucasus, in the Crimea in Courland, or in East Prussia, entire armies have been surrounded, and we have lost them in their entirety. At the same time that we lose units with combat experience in a foolish way, we have to send to the main front other divisions that have been created in an improvised way and that lack combat value. Naturally, these troops are incapable of facing the vanguards of the Red Army, which, after annihilating our weak divisions, continue advancing. Rausch also commented that due to this weakness of the German army units, we had to add the Allied control of the skies, which, in addition to preventing the production of weapons and ammunition, also made their transfer to the front very difficult. So many German units were practically out of stock. Finally, the German general concluded by saying that, taking all this into account, it was not very clear that Germany could emerge victorious and that they were facing almost certain defeat. Here we have to point out that Rausch obviously knew that Germany's days were numbered, but he wanted to say it as gently as possible. When he finished his presentation, Rausch remained silent, along with Himmler, who stared at him for a couple of minutes without saying anything. Later, to Rausch's surprise, Himmler approached him and told him that he agreed with him. Totally elated, the German general, who had seen that his point of view was shared by Himmler, told the Reichsführer, "Then, if you know all this, why haven't you informed Hitler?" Himmler told him that he had told all this to the German leader a long time ago, but when he did so, he accused him of being a defeatist and pointed out the door for him to leave his presence. Although Rausch did not know at that time whether what Himmler told him was true or not, this event was later confirmed by another officer who had been present at those discussions between Hitler and Himmler. The conversation then returned to the new offensive that was being prepared in Pomerania, which, according to Himmler, had to be launched by Hitler's order and was finally launched on February 16th. However, as Rausch had calculated, the attack was completely stalled for the next day.
Early April 1945. Despite the enormous efforts made, it was increasingly clear that the end for the Germans could come at any moment. General Heinrici, a man whom the German leaders detested, has just been given command of the Vistula Army Group to take charge of the last German defensive line, which was between the Soviets and Berlin. As we just said, although this general was not liked by the leadership of the Third Reich, there was no one better than him in establishing rigid defensive systems, and due to this need, he had been called back to active service. German leaders such as Hitler and Göring, who were increasingly concerned about the situation, did not take long to request a meeting with him so that he could inform them of the possibilities that the German army had of rejecting the next Soviet offensive. The first to call it was Hitler, in a meeting that took place in his Berlin bunker during the first days of April. The tension at that time was maximum, since the Soviets were on the bank of the Oder just 70 kilometers from the capital, and the Western Allies had broken the front on the Rhine, and were advancing practically unopposed towards the interior of Germany. At this meeting, Keitel, Bergdorf, Krebs, Martin Bormann, Himmler, Göring and Dönitz, among others, were present, with the presence of these last three men being especially relevant in the auction, sale, and purchase of units that took place at said conference, which we will see throughout the program. The conference began when Hitler finally entered the small room of the bunker, in which the different generals and other leaders were gathered. That was the first time in a long time that Heinrici saw Hitler in person, and his impression was quite bad, since he saw him very deteriorated. The exact words that Heinrici used to describe what he felt were, that the German leader seemed like a man who had no more than 24 hours to live, and who looked like a walking corpse. It should be noted that Heinrici hated these types of meetings because he considered them a waste of time, and he preferred to stay in an area close to the front. The first to speak was Krebs, to give way to Heinrici, so that he could say what he had to say as soon as possible so that he could return to the front immediately, since his presence there was essential. Heinrici's intention was for everyone to understand that the situation was desperate, and that it would be impossible to resist the next Soviet offensive. Not wanting to say this information in a very direct way, the German general began little by little to warm up the atmosphere. In this way, Heinrici initially focused on making a description of the two armies that defended the Oder, from Frankfurt to the mouth of the river some 150 kilometers further north. Heinrici said in this first intervention that many efforts had been made to leave Bussy's Ninth Army in the best possible conditions, because it was the place where the main Soviet attack was expected. However, the 3rd Panzer Army, which was located on the northern flank, was in very precarious conditions, and was not expected to be able to contain the enemy onslaught once the waters of the river receded and its flow was reduced. The general continued to comment that the shortcomings of these last German armies were total. There was a lack of weapons of all types, ammunition, tanks, fuel, and well-trained or experienced soldiers. As if that were not enough, the best panzer units that Heinrici had in his sector as reserves had been sent to the outskirts of Prague. The reason was that the main attack was expected in that area, and not from the Oder in the direction of Berlin. So, this meant that Heinrici had no troops in the rear capable of plugging any breakthrough the Soviets made. This would bring an immediate collapse of the front, and certain defeat. After these words, all the men in the room were a little impressed and surprised, because they were not used to someone explaining the facts in such a clear way, and even less so in the presence of Hitler. The response he obtained was from Krebs, who simply said that he should not worry, since he would receive all the necessary reinforcements of both men and material during the coming weeks. Heinrici did not take this comment seriously, as he knew it was an empty and unrealistic promise. After this first intervention, and seeing that he had not managed to make them understand how critical the situation was, Heinrici decided to raise the tone and explain it in another way. Next, Heinrici said, "My Führer, I do not believe that the forces on the Oder front will be able to withstand the enormous attacks that the Russians are going to launch against us. The forces we have now are just chips of the old military capacity of our army. Most of the front units do not have adequate training or combat experience. Many officers are simple civil servants without military training who have been promoted in haste. To this we must add the lack of ammunition and all types of weapons and reserves." Hitler then responded in a calm manner and said, "Everything necessary must be done to prepare these formations. We still have time to do it before the battle." Heinrici responded that it was too late, and that in any case the little extra training that could be given to them was not going to give them real combat experience. After this, both men entered into a debate, in which Hitler commented that the Soviets were throwing in their last reserves, these men being of very poor quality, which would balance the situation. However, Heinrici made him see that this was not the case, and that this information was completely erroneous, since the Soviets had very experienced troops and were by no means at the limit of their capabilities. Raising the tone again so that they understood the real situation, Heinrici commented, "I must warn you that in view of the transfer of armored units to Prague, I do not have reserves. We do not have anything. What will happen after the heavy Soviet bombings? Will our troops withstand that initial impact? Maybe so, but only for a while. From then on, our troops will be reduced little by little without us being able to send any replacements, and then everything will be lost. After a few days, everything will be over. With that said, there was a great silence in the room. In an attempt to encourage Hitler and continue to gain his trust and approval, Göring said, "My Führer, I will immediately place 100,000 Luftwaffe men at your disposal. In a few days, they will appear on the Oder front." Upon hearing this, and not wanting to be outdone, Himmler said, "The SS has the honor of providing another 25,000 fighters for the Oder front." And finally Donitz, who was not going to be any less, declared, "I will also send about 12,000 sailors who will immediately leave their ships to reinforce the Oder." In Heinrici's words, everything had become an auction, and they were seeing who could offer the most. After a series of considerations by everyone, Hitler finally told Heinrici, "Well, you already have 150,000 men, which is about 12 divisions. There you have your reservations." Heinrici, who could not contain his disbelief, then said that these troops were not at all prepared for combat on land, and that they would only serve to increase the number of casualties that they themselves would have in battle. Naturally, these words did not sit well with Himmler, Göring or Donitz, who began to indicate that their troops were of the highest quality. Again, Heinrici commented that all those men would be sacrificed at the front without any type of positive result for them, and that the only thing he wanted was for them to send back the armored formations that had just been taken from him, but this is what Hitler said, it was impossible. Finally, the German leader told Heinrici that the most important thing in this situation was for him to maintain faith in victory, since his defeatist character was of no use. Hitler's last phrase to Heinrici was, "I tell you, Colonel General, that if you are aware that this battle must be won, it will be won. If you manage to transmit the same belief to your troops, you will achieve victory, and with it, the greatest success of the war." This was the last hope that the German leader kept in his head, to try to reach a kind of peace or ceasefire, if he managed to repel these last Soviet attacks. Heinrici then gave up and knew that he had not been able to fulfill his objective, because he had not managed to make those men understand how difficult the situation was. So, immediately afterwards, he picked up the papers from him and said goodbye to him. Once outside the bunker, Heinrici told his assistant, "It's no use anymore. Everything is useless. All useless." A few days later, on April 8th, another of the most surreal meetings of these last days of the Third Reich took place, this time with Hermann Göring as its protagonist. On this occasion, Hermann Göring invited Heinrici to lunch at his private palace called Carinhall, which was located northwest of Berlin just 30 kilometers away from the Oder River. In this meeting, and as we will see below, Göring will appear very nervous, and will threaten Heinrici with telling Hitler a whole series of bad things about him, so that he will be removed from command. As we have said before, we are at the beginning of April 1945, at which time the Soviet offensive on Berlin was imminent. In addition to threatening the German capital, the Soviets also threatened many mansions and castles in which high-ranking officials, such as Hermann Göring, continued with their luxurious lives. Thus, these men were determined to do everything possible to prevent the Soviets from reaching their homes. Having explained the reason for Göring's concern, let us now focus on the bad relationship he had with Heinrici. The antipathy that both men had for each other dates back to 1942, with the disaster of the Sixth Army's air supply. Heinrici had always accused Göring of mishandling the situation, and of promising actions that he could not deliver. This was a thought that the general expressed publicly, and as is evident, Göring did not like him at all. The Reich Marshal, for his part, accused Heinrici of being insubordinate, and of not complying with what he was ordered. In addition to these accusations that both men had already maintained since 1943, a few days before, another event had occurred that had led them to a new confrontation in the presence of Hitler. This had occurred during the meeting in Hitler's bunker that we have just analyzed, in which Heinrici had pointed out that the forces that Göring was going to send from the Luftwaffe were not suitable for combat. These words had not sat well with Göring, who assured Hitler that his soldiers were of the highest quality. The situation being both personal and military, Göring invited Heinrici to lunch at his rural mansion in Carinhall, so that the two could chat. Heinrici did not like this invitation at all, because in addition to not feeling any sympathy for Göring, he did not want to leave his command post either, since he knew that the Soviet offensive would occur at any moment. However, despite everything, the truth was that he could not refuse. From the greeting that both men gave each other, the tension and the little sympathy they had for each other was noticeable. As it could not be otherwise, Heinrici was impressed by the size and luxury of Hermann Göring's property, which he had named Carinhall in honor of his deceased wife. The first words that were spoken were a series of accusations, among which I highlight Göring's accusation of having insulted him in front of Hitler, when he said that his parachute division was not ready for combat. As punishment, Hermann told him that he was going to remove them from his command, and in their place, he was going to send them further south under the orders of Schorner, because he was a real soldier. Once these first accusations were over, Heinrici and Göring sat down to have lunch. Again the Reich Marshal began to attack Heinrici. This time, he focused on what he had personally seen when a few days ago he had visited various stretches of the Oder front. Exactly, these were his words. "I have toured all the armies that you have under your command, and in one sector after another, I have found men who did nothing. I even saw some that were hiding playing cards," Göring said indignantly. "Furthermore, I saw others from the work organization who did not even have shovels to carry out their work. In some places, I found their soldiers without field kitchens, and in other sectors almost no defenses had been built. Everywhere I saw his men lazing around and going from one place to another without doing anything. I want you to know that I intend to go tell the Führer all of this." I end by saying Göring. At such words, Heinrici was about to unleash all his anger on Göring, but finally he restrained himself, and thought that he was not worth it. Finally, when he finished lunch, Heinrici got up from his chair and prepared to leave. As he left Göring's magnificent estate, he looked at her slowly and said, "Hopefully my slackers can save this beautiful estate of yours from the battles to come." Göring, at these words, stared at him with great coldness and anger, and immediately afterwards he turned around and re-entered his mansion. How much longer could he continue living there? Göring surely thought. Heinrici would later comment that if Göring had asked him that question, he would have answered that he would not be there for more than a week, because as soon as the attack began, he would be in Soviet hands. Finally, Zhukov's offensive would begin on April 16th, although Göring was a little lucky and it occurred a little further south of his residence, and it did not affect him directly. In this way, he greatly benefited from Rokossovsky's army launching its attack a few days later than Zhukov, because his troops had had less time to organize. In any case, on April 28 Carinhall was blown to the ground by order of Göring, who did not want under any circumstances for his most prized mansion to fall into Soviet hands. The Reich Marshal would spend the last days of the war in another residence in the Alps, finding himself under house arrest and surveillance on Hitler's orders. This was due to the telegram that he sent to Hitler's bunker, in which it was interpreted that he wanted to carry out a coup d'état. As you know, Hermann Göring would end up surrendering to the Western Allies, after which he would be imprisoned and tried in Nuremberg, possibly committing suicide just before his official execution. So, what did you think of the program? How do you assess the final attitudes of Hitler and Göring?